Imagine this. A 12-year-old girl is standing at the edge of a frozen lake in northern Ontario, and she is speaking out loud to someone no one else can see. Her boots are soaked through. It is February. The wind is the kind that makes your eyes water before you even feel the cold. She has been out there for 40 minutes. Her older brother came to find her and stopped when he saw her lips moving, and then turned around and walked back to the house without saying a word to anyone. Nobody in the family talked about what happened at that lake, not for years. And maybe that is where you have to start, not with the miracles, not with the crowds that would come later, not with the name that would eventually be known in 3 countries, but with a girl standing alone in the cold, talking to God, completely certain that he was listening. Her name was Edith Muriel Covington. She was born in 1881 in a small farming community called Hespeler, in what is now southern Ontario. Her father ran a dry goods store. Her mother played piano for the local Methodist congregation every Sunday without fail. They were not a mystical family. They were not particularly unusual. They paid their bills on time. They kept a clean house. They went to church, because that is what you did. But Edith was something different from the very beginning, and the people who knew her as a child would say so later, when anyone thought to ask. There was a quality of attention about her that unsettled people. She would look at you and it felt like she was not just listening to your words, but to something behind them. She was not rude about it. She was not strange in the way that makes other children uncomfortable. She was just more present than everyone else, more still. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who seems to have a quality of inner quiet that has nothing to do with being quiet on the outside. That was Edith. She could be laughing at the dinner table, her father would say later, and you still felt like half of her was somewhere you couldn't follow. She began praying at a very young age. Not the rote prayers her mother taught her. Those she did too, kneeling beside her bed, the Lord's Prayer in a small, earnest voice. But these other prayers, the ones no one asked her to do, the ones she did alone, those were something else entirely. She described them once, years later, in a letter that survived only because the woman who received it kept it folded inside her Bible for the rest of her life. Edith wrote, "When I was a girl, I did not pray to receive something. I prayed because I had found a door that was always open and I could not stay away from it." She finished school at 15, which was not unusual for the time. Her father expected her to help in the store. She did this without complaint. She was good at it. She had the kind of manner with customers that made them feel seen, that made them come back not just for the goods but for whatever it was she gave them without knowing she gave it. Her father used to joke that Edith could sell a man a bolt of cloth and he'd go home feeling like he'd been to church. In 1898, when Edith was 17, a visiting preacher came through Hespeler. He was from Toronto. His name was Arthur Newing, and he held a 3-night revival in the town hall, because the Methodist church was too small for what he expected. He was the kind of preacher who would later be considered old-fashioned, loud, urgent, given to long stretches of silence after a key point, as if daring God to fill the room. The first night, 40 people came. The second night, nearly 100. The third night, Edith was in the back row with her friend Harriet. What happened that third night is documented. Arthur Newing preached on surrender, not on salvation, not on morality, not on the duties of a Christian life. He preached on one thing only, what it means to stop holding something back from God. He said that most people who called themselves believers had given God the house, but kept one room locked. He said God was not interested in partial occupancy. Edith said nothing that night. She went home. She helped her mother with the dishes. She said her good nights. And then she went to her room and she did not sleep. She would later describe what happened in those hours as the emptying. she wrote. It was not a feeling of joy, not at first. It was more like what I can imagine it would feel like to have a surgeon reach into your chest and remove something you did not know was causing the pain. It hurt. And then it was over. And then the room was full of something I had no word for. She told no one. That is the thing that must be understood. The hidden always precedes the visible. Edith Muriel Covington was quietly transformed in a small bedroom in Hespeler, Ontario, in the year 1898. And she went downstairs the next morning and opened the store at 7 and helped her father with the deliveries. And nobody knew that anything had changed. She did not make an announcement. She did not tell her mother. She did not write in a diary that survives. She just prayed, more than before, longer than before, with a quality of focus that would have been frightening to watch, if anyone had been watching. In 1901, she moved to Toronto to live with her aunt and to take a position as a seamstress. The city was loud and crowded, and smelled of horses and coal smoke, and she loved it. She found a small congregation on Adelaide Street that met in an upstairs room above a printing office. The pastor was a man named Harold Foster, who was kind and thoughtful, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen in his city, or for the role that one of his quietest members was about to play in it. These were the years when something strange was moving through the English-speaking world. News had come from Wales of a revival that had spread through entire valley towns, that had emptied the taverns and filled the coal mines with men singing hymns underground, that had seen thousands come to faith in a matter of weeks. The stories were being reprinted in Canadian papers, usually with the same skeptical detachment that newspapers bring to anything they cannot explain. Arthur Newing, still traveling, still preaching, had seen something similar in pockets of rural Ohio. Letters were passing between ministers across the country, asking a question that no one could quite form properly. Is something coming? Is something already here? Edith read every account she could find. She found them not interesting but urgent, the way you find urgent a letter that is addressed to you specifically. She began praying with 2 other women from Harold Foster's congregation. Their names were Vera McLeod and a woman everyone called simply Bess. They were not organized about it. They did not have a formal prayer meeting. They met on Tuesday evenings in Edith's aunt's front parlor, which was cold because the aunt was frugal with wood, and they prayed for 2 hours, and then they drank tea and went home. Nobody paid attention to this. Why would they? 3 women meeting in a cold parlor on Tuesday nights. It was not newsworthy. It was not even noticeable. They did it for 2 years. 2 years of Tuesday evenings. 2 years of prayers that went, by Edith's own account, mostly unanswered in any visible way. Vera got discouraged after the first winter. Bess was steadier. There were Tuesdays when it was just Edith. Because Vera was unwell or Bess had a family obligation, and Edith would kneel in the cold parlor alone and pray by herself for 2 hours, and then drink tea alone and go to bed. What are you doing right now with the ordinary invisible hours of your life? That question is not a rhetorical device. It is the question that Edith's story asks, unavoidably, of everyone who encounters it. In the spring of 1903, a small notice appeared in a Toronto church circular. Not a newspaper, just a printed sheet that circulated among several congregations, announcing that a series of prayer meetings would be held at a private address on Pemberton Avenue. The notice was unsigned. The meetings were open to anyone who wanted to come. There was no speaker announced, no program listed. Just an address and a time. The first night, 7 people showed up. Edith was one of them. She sat in a cane-backed chair in someone's sitting room, and she looked around at the other 6 people. 2 middle-aged men, 3 women about her age, 1 older woman in a gray shawl. And she had the sudden and absolute certainty that something was about to begin. She did not speak that night. Neither did most of the others. The meeting lasted 3 hours. A man named Owen Abernethy led it, which mostly meant that he opened with scripture and then stepped back and let the silence do what silence does when people who are genuinely hungry fill a room together. At one point near the end, the woman in the gray shawl began to weep, not in distress, in something that looked, to the people watching, like relief. By the 4th week, there were 30 people in the sitting room. By the 6th, they had to move to a hall. Owen Abernethy, who was a carpenter by trade and had never preached in his life, found himself standing in front of 60 people one Friday night in June, and feeling, he would say later, as though his mouth had been handed to someone else. And this is where Edith's story becomes harder to tell. Not because the facts are unclear, they are actually well documented, in letters and in the accounts of people who were there. But because what began to happen in that hall on Pemberton Avenue does not fit easily into the categories that most people carry around for what religion is supposed to look like. People were healed of physical ailments, not all of them, not in any predictable pattern, but enough that it became something people talked about. A man who had walked with a limp for 6 years from a mill injury found one morning that the pain was gone. A woman whose vision had been deteriorating for a decade went for her fitting at the optician and was told, baffled, that her prescription had improved. These are not the accounts of excitable people. They are in letters and in the careful, somewhat embarrassed, written records of Owen Abernethy, who was not an excitable man, and who clearly found the whole situation theologically overwhelming. But more than the healings, and this is what the accounts keep coming back to, there was simply a quality of presence in that room. People would describe it differently, but with a remarkable consistency of feeling, that something was in the room with them, that they were not alone in any ordinary sense, that the air itself had a weight to it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. Edith was at the center of it, not at the front. She never stood at the front. Owen was at the front. But Owen himself said, years later, that when he looked at the room during those meetings, his eyes always came back to Edith. There was a quality to her attention, he wrote, that I can only describe by saying that the room seemed to organize itself around her stillness. She was not doing anything. She was simply present, fully, more fully than anyone else. The Toronto press eventually got wind of it. They were not kind. The headline in one paper read, "Strange Doings on Pemberton Avenue. Enthusiasts claim divine visitation." The article was written with the weary tone of someone who has been assigned to cover something they find tedious and slightly embarrassing. It mentioned speaking in unknown tongues and trembling among the participants, and dismissed the entire enterprise in 4 paragraphs. Edith kept a copy of that article, not for pride and not for bitterness. She kept it because she found it funny. She wrote to Vera McLeod, "They have described our parlor prayer meeting as if we were a circus. I did not know we were so entertaining. God apparently has a sense of humor." The revival, because that is what it was, lasted in its concentrated form for about 18 months. Then it spread. That is the word that keeps appearing in the records. Spread. Like something poured into water. The people who had been in that room on Pemberton Avenue went back to their own churches, their own communities, their own families, and things began to happen in those places too. A congregation in Hamilton. A prayer group in Kingston. A minister in London, Ontario, who had received a letter from Owen Abernethy and who spent a week in something he could only call anguished seeking before experiencing what he described as the opening of a room I did not know existed inside myself. None of this happened quickly. That is another thing the history tends to erase. The slowness. The grinding, ordinary slowness of real change. Edith was still a seamstress. She was still going to work every morning, and coming home in the evening and cooking her meals in her aunt's kitchen. She was praying, always praying, but she was not a celebrity. She was not traveling and preaching. She was not building an organization. She was 33 years old in 1914 when war came and her brother went overseas, and the bottom fell out of a lot of things for a lot of people. Owen Abernethy lost a son at Ypres. Harold Foster's congregation, which had been growing, contracted again under the weight of grief. Edith's aunt died. The Pemberton Avenue Hall was sold to a business concern, and Edith prayed. She did not stop. This is the thing that defines her, looking back. Not the revival, not the healings, not the press coverage, not the spread circles of influence. What defines her is the Tuesday nights, and the February lake, and the cold parlor, and every invisible ordinary hour of a life that kept showing up to the same door that had been opened since she was 12 years old. She was not without struggle. The letters make this clear. There were stretches, months at a time, when she described her prayers as hitting a ceiling, when she felt, as she wrote once, as though I am speaking into a closed hand. There were seasons of doubt, not about God's existence, but about her own clarity. Had she heard correctly? Was she still on the right road? She wrote to a friend in 1919, I sometimes feel that God is very patient with my questions and very unbothered by my confusion. It is I who am bothered. He seems to find the whole situation quite settled. After the war, she began quietly to be sought out. Not by newspapers, by people. Ordinary people who had heard, through one connection or another, that there was a woman in Toronto who prayed, and that something happened when she prayed. They would write letters. Some would come in person. She met them in her kitchen mostly. She made tea. She listened. She prayed with them. She did not charge money. She did not keep records of results. She would have been embarrassed by a list of outcomes. A young woman named Josephine came to her in 1921 with a child who had been sick for 3 years with something the doctors named and could not treat. Josephine came not because she had particular faith, but because she had run out of other options, and someone in her building had mentioned Edith's name. She sat in Edith's kitchen, and she was honest. I don't know if I believe any of this. And Edith said, and Josephine wrote this down later exactly. That's all right, you don't have to. Just stay. The child recovered. Josephine spent the rest of her life in that same kitchen. Figuratively speaking, she became one of Edith's closest companions, and when Edith died, Josephine was the one who gathered the letters and kept them. What happened to Edith Covington is not, in the end, a story that can be fully told. That is part of what makes it honest. She did not found a denomination. She did not write a book. She did not travel the world preaching to thousands. The Pemberton Avenue revival has a small footnote in some histories of Canadian Pentecostalism, and her name appears in those footnotes without much elaboration. She is not famous. She was never famous in her own lifetime in any way that she would have recognized as fame. What she did was pray, for 60 years. In cold parlors and busy kitchens and frozen lakeshores and ordinary rooms. In the small hours before anyone else was awake, in the middle of losses that were real and griefs that were legitimate, through decades of visible result and decades of no visible result at all. She showed up to the door she had found when she was 12, and she never stopped showing up. She died in 1951 in the same city where she had spent most of her adult life. She was 69. Josephine was with her. Her brother's daughter, Marguerite, was there. It was a Tuesday. The people who were touched by Edith's life, not all of them, but many, would later say the same thing in different words, that she was not trying to give them anything, that she was not performing faith or producing a demonstration of what faith looks like. That being around her was like sitting near a fire that had been burning for a very long time, steadily and without drama, and that you could warm yourself at it. without her even noticing that you were cold. Owen Abernethy outlived her by 4 years. In one of his last letters, written when he was in his 80s and his handwriting had gone shaky, but his clarity had not, he said this, People sometimes ask me what was the secret of those years, those meetings, what made them what they were. I always want to say, Edith. And then I stop myself because that is not quite right either. The secret was the God that Edith had found. But she found him first before any of us thought to look. And she never let go. That is all I know to say. She found the door, and she never let go of the handle, and eventually so many people followed her through it that I lost count. The fire she carried did not announce itself, and it did not write headlines. It did not need defending or explaining or advertising. It simply burned, and it is still burning in the lives of people who do not know her name. The question is not whether someone like Edith Covington existed. She did. The question is what you do with the ordinary invisible hours that make up most of a life, and whether you are willing to keep showing up to a door that does not always open on your schedule, and to trust that the fire on the other side is worth every cold Tuesday it asks of you.